one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed.
I don't ambition power, no, only to serve my country.
And right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today.
December 7th, 1941.
The New World Order.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
Over the years, even the most naive American has had a suspicion that there must be a reason why, most of the time, our government helps our enemies and betrays our friends. Just a handful of scholars have seriously studied the subject. The ones who have done it have concluded that the US government has been hijacked by a group of rich, powerful individuals who have been using it to advance their own private interests. This group has been called different names: the power elite, the insiders, the secret team, the shadow government, the usurpers, the invisible government.
Several authors have studied the invisible government of the United States. Probably the most known are David Wise and Thomas B. Ross, whose book The Invisible Government became a bestseller in 1964. According to these authors, a few opportunistic CIA officers created a splinter faction inside the CIA and put it to work for personal gain. Another attempt to bring government conspiracies to light was Bill Moyer's documentary, The Secret Government.
The secret government is an interlocking network of official functionaries, spies, mercenaries, ex-generals, profiteers, and super patriots who, for a variety of motives, operate outside the legitimate institutions of government.
A little after, a picture of the CIA building at Langley, Virginia fills the screen, and Moyer's voice off-camera affirms, "This is the house the Cold War built. The CIA, the core of the new secret government." But both works, mistakenly or intentionally, point to the CIA and other intelligence agencies as the source of this secret or invisible government. In his excellent study of the CIA, The Secret Team, Fletcher Prouty explains how a group of CIA officers have managed, through the administration of selective information to the president and other government leaders, to gain virtual control of the US government. According to Prouty, the CIA is a great monstrous machine with tremendous and terrible power. Moreover, in an article Prouty wrote for the February 1986 issue of Freedom magazine, he further clarifies the issue. The CIA is the best friend of the top executives of America's biggest business, and it works for them at home and abroad. One of the few authors who early on pointed to the true source of the invisible government was Dan Smoot, in his book, The Invisible Government. Smoot, a former member of the FBI headquarters staff in Washington, D.C., pointed to the organization where the true source of the invisible government of the United States resides. According to Smoot, the ultimate secret goal of this organization is to create a one-world socialist system and to make the U.S. an official part of it.
Like ninja warriors, the main weapon used by the conspirators who have managed to infiltrate the US government and most of the American life has been their invisibility. Until just a few years ago, this group of rich, powerful people with almost total control over the three branches of our government, the mainstream press, and the educational system has been almost unknown to most of the American people. But we cannot blame the people. The conspirators have never been identified in the mainstream press, much less in textbooks. How come, one may ask, if these people are so important, have they managed to pass unnoticed to the mainstream press? Well, they are known by the mainstream press, but fully under the control of the conspirators. The mainstream press has practiced self-censorship, failing to inform the American people about their existence. And the conspirators have thanked the press for their good job on their behalf. Speaking in 1991 at a Bilderberger meeting in Germany, David Rockefeller expressed his gratitude to the American press for their silence.
We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries.
But now, thanks mostly to the internet that has acted as an ultraviolet light revealing the harmful bacteria, the conspirators are losing their powers of invisibility. And more people are discovering who they are, how they operate, and what their secret plans are. I'm talking about the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, and their parasite organizations like the Bilderberger Group, the Trilateral Commission, the United Nations organizations, and the World Forum, just to mention the most important ones of a constellation of organizations working hard for the implementation of a new world order. To the man on the street, forensics has to do with crime, autopsies, and the like. But like Yahoo, Google, and other search engines in the internet, forensic science mostly has to do with links.
When a criminal commits a crime, the first thing she tries to do is to disguise, erase, or destroy all physical evidence linking her to the crime. The job of the forensic investigator consists of discovering these links and revealing the links between the crime and the criminal. The authors who first managed to point to the Council on Foreign Relations as the true center of the conspiracy discovered something amazing. Behind every act of treason to this country, working in the shadows, there is always one or more members of the Council on Foreign Relations or their associate organizations.
Mentioning all these acts of treason will make this list too long, but just a minor cut of the fruit will be enough to reveal its rotten entrails.
Cecil Rhodes establishes a secret society called the Circle of Initiates. Like most secret organizations, it had one individual or a very small group at its center. Lord Milner, an agent of the Rothschilds and the principal trustee of the Cecil Rhodes fortune, creates an outer circle to the Circle of Initiates. He names it the Association of Helpers, also called the Round Table Group. President Woodrow Wilson and his advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House, illegally create the Federal Reserve Bank and the Internal Revenue Service. Both organizations are private corporations under the guise of U.S. government institutions. The Round Table is later transformed by Colonel Edward Mandell House, John Maynard Keynes, Arnold Toynbee, John Foster Dulles, and others into a publicly acknowledged formal council, now known as the Institute of International Affairs. The conspirators decide to break down the Institute of International Affairs into an American branch, the Council on Foreign Relations, and a British branch, the Royal Institute for International Affairs. The Council on Foreign Relations begins the publication of its official organ, the magazine Foreign Affairs. A few years later, the magazine becomes a sort of crystal ball, forecasting the direction where the U.S. and the world is heading to. A panic in the Wall Street stock market, followed by a full crash, causes a severe economic crisis, later known as the Great Depression. The crisis affects first the United States, and soon after, Latin America and the whole industrialized world. There are those who suspect that the crisis was artificially created by the bankers who own the Federal Reserve Bank. President Franklin Roosevelt provokes and facilitates the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor as a pretext to push the American people into war in Europe. While American soldiers are dying in Europe fighting Nazi Germany, Prescott Bush, Henry Ford, Nelson Rockefeller, and Allen Dulles keep cutting business deals with German corporations, helping the Nazi war machine. The U.S. delegation to the San Francisco Conference, where the creation of the United Nations organization is discussed, includes 47 CFR members. Among them, Adlai Stevenson, John Foster Dulles, Nelson Rockefeller, and Alger Hiss. The charter of the UNO they approve had been previously written at the Harold Pratt House in Manhattan, headquarters of the Council on Foreign Relations. Following advice from Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and General George Marshall, President Truman orders the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nagasaki, where no military installation was located, was the site of the largest Christian community in Japan. At the end of the war, the Rockefellers, with the help of their agent Allen Dulles, allow many Nazis to escape to America via Argentina, recruits ex-Nazi officers to work for the CIA, and brings Nazi scientists to America. President Truman creates the Central Intelligence Agency. George Marshall and Dean Acheson press President Truman to stop providing military supplies to Chiang Kai-shek, thus allowing for the communist takeover of China. Headed by Frank Wisner, Allen Dulles, and Richard Helms, the CIA begins Operation Mockingbird. Under the false flag of fighting communism, its goal is to recruit American media news organizations and journalists as agents to disseminate disinformation. Testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on February 17, James Warburg, son of CFR founder Paul Warburg, prophesizes, "We shall have world government whether or not you like it, by conquest or consent." Dean Acheson and Dean Rusk arranged the no-win undeclared war in Korea and the removal of General Douglas MacArthur. General MacArthur had a plan to win the war. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, receives hundreds of letters from concerned citizens and members of Congress, accusing the Council on Foreign Relations of treason and promoting communism through its agents, infiltrated within the U.S. government. Hoover orders to begin an investigation. Soon after, President Eisenhower dictates an order prohibiting the FBI to investigate federal government employees. In his farewell speech, President Eisenhower alerts the nation about the existence of a military-industrial complex in the United States.
Whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
President Kennedy signs Executive Order 11110, returning to the U.S. Treasury the power to print currency independently of the Federal Reserve Bank. $4 billion in U.S. notes are printed, and they have just begun to circulate when Kennedy is assassinated. The first thing President Johnson, not a CFR member, does as he is sworn into office is to recall the bills and destroy them. A whitewashing commission is created to investigate President Kennedy's assassination. 4 of its 7 members, Allen Dulles, John McCloy, John Sherman Cooper, and Gerald Ford, are CFR members. The commission concludes that Oswald was a lone assassin. A growing majority of the American public is convinced that Kennedy was the victim of a government conspiracy. Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk fabricate the Gulf of Tonkin incident, claiming that North Vietnamese PTs have attacked the destroyers USN Maddox and USS Turner Joy. The attack never happened, but it gives Johnson the pretext to escalate the war that eventually costs the lives of thousands of Americans. Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, and Henry Cabot Lodge push the U.S. fully into the Vietnam conflict, and then draw up odd rules of engagement, making victory impossible. As a part of a discussion group on intelligence and foreign policy, senior CIA officer Richard Bissell gives a secret lecture at the Pratt House on covert action. Among the participants are Douglas Dillon, Alan Dulles, Theodore Sorensen, and 13 other senior CFR members. Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger continue their treacherous policies, which lead to the communist takeover of South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Harvard professor Zbigniew Brzezinski writes Between Two Ages. The book shows that Brzezinski's thinking closely parallels that of CFR founder Colonel Edward Mandell House. Nelson Rockefeller loves the book so much, he offers Brzezinski the direction of his new pet project, the Trilateral Commission. The CFR conspirators realize that the war they have created has become a liability. They then use Daniel Ellsberg to bring the Pentagon Papers to the CFR-controlled New York Times. The publication of the Pentagon Papers helps to create an anti-war feeling among the American people. The newly created Trilateral Commission publishes a report which recommends that, in order for globalization to succeed, American manufacturing jobs have to be sent abroad, and American workers' wages have to decline. Henry Kissinger writes National Security Study Memorandum 200. It delineates a genocidal policy of depopulating much of the African continent to allow U.S. transnationals, not the Africans, to exploit the continent's natural resources. Following the advice of Zbigniew Brzezinski, Cyrus Vance, and Warren Christopher, the Jimmy Carter administration undermines U.S. allies in Iran and Nicaragua. Under President Reagan, not a CFR member, George Shultz, William J. Casey, and Malcolm Baldrige arrange U.S. foreign aid to Communist Romania, Communist Poland, and the USSR. They also obstruct the fight of anti-communists in El Salvador. President George H.W. Bush, CFR, authorizes American companies to provide Saddam Hussein with samples of anthrax and botulinum, allegedly for medical research. A few years later, Hussein sent some of the samples to his friend, Fidel Castro. A deal initiated by ex-President Jimmy Carter, President Bill Clinton, gives North Korea $5 billion worth of oil and authorizes American companies to give the Kim Jong regime 2 nuclear reactors and $2 billion to develop it, allegedly for non-military use. Incited by the U.S. government, Saddam Hussein launches a military attack against Kuwait, giving President George H.W. Bush the pretext for the Gulf War. On September 11th, President George H.W. Bush delivers a speech to the Congress titled, "Toward a New World Order." During a recess of the meetings at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, millionaire Maurice Strong, CFR Trilateral, declares that the goal of a group of billionaires like himself is the collapse of industrial civilization. The CFR's annual report affirms, obviously the stage is being set in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in the Middle East, and elsewhere for a new world order. Writing in the Los Angeles Times about the U.S. Congress approval of the NAFTA agreement, Henry Kissinger states, "What Congress will have before it is not a conventional trade agreement, but the architecture of a new international system, a first step toward a new world order." The summer issue of CFR's organ, Foreign Affairs, publishes an article by Professor Samuel P. Huntington about the coming clash of civilizations, particularly between the Judeo-Christian and Muslim worlds. Threat of Islamic fundamentalists is discussed in one of the meetings of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Zbigniew Brzezinski, CFR Trilateral, writes The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Geostrategic Objectives, a book in which he warns about the coming terrorist threat. He cites a historical example of why a catastrophic event is needed to galvanize Americans against terrorism. The public supported America's engagement in World War II, largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. A group of so-called neo-cons, among them Richard Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Norman Potterz, Richard Pearl, Louis Scooter Libby, John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, and Robert Kagan, create the Project for a New American Century, which promotes a new era of American imperialism. In one of their initial documents, they mention the need of a Pearl Harbor-like catastrophic catalyzing event to galvanize public opinion in support of their plans. Following orders from President Clinton, CFR Trilateral, and with the support of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, General Wesley Clark sends NATO troops to invade Kosovo, allowing the killing of hundreds of Serbian Christians by Muslims. The war directly benefits the Kosovo Liberation Army, a Muslim terrorist group with ties to Osama bin Laden. September 11th, President George W. Bush and his close advisors, among them Vice President Richard Cheney and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, allow the September 11th attacks to happen. Then Bush declares a long war on terrorism. Soon after, he dictates new laws canceling habeas corpus and several other constitutional rights, and creates the Office of Homeland Security. President George W. Bush appoints Henry Kissinger to chair a commission to investigate the failure to detect and stop the 9/11 attacks. Faced with widespread negative reaction, Kissinger declines. Finally, Bush appoints a new commission, chaired by Thomas Keane, CFR, with Lee Hamilton as vice chair, and members Jamie Gorelick and Philip Zelikoff. The commission produces a whitewash report in which everything is explained as the result of honest mistakes and lack of interagency communication. Ben S. Bernanke, the new president of the Federal Reserve Bank, admitted in 2002 that the Great Depression of 1929 to 1934 was artificially created by the bank. Under false pretenses, President George W. Bush orders the invasion of Iraq. Kissinger's protege, Paul Bremer, is appointed first colonial administrator of the country. Then, closely following the Korea and Vietnam cases, Bush draws up rules that tie American soldiers' hands behind their backs, thus making victory impossible. Very soon after, Iraq becomes a Vietnam-type quagmire. The Venezuelan people call for a referendum to recall Hugo Chavez. Ex-President Jimmy Carter, CFR Trilateral, offers his help to oversee the voting. Despite widespread cheating, Carter gives his approval to the election, legitimizing Chavez and consolidating him in power. President Bush opens the south border of the United States to a veritable invasion of Mexican workers. The poor illegal immigrants, whose only intention is finding a better way to live through hard work, ignore that they are pawns in a secret CFR plan to destroy sovereignty, as well as the economy of both Mexico and the United States. The leaders of the governments of Mexico, the United States, and Canada reinforce the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America agreement when they meet again to focus on their agenda to erase national borders. A CFR study commission, which includes William Weld, Doris Meissner, and Robert Pastor, produces a document titled Building a North American Community. It details a 5-year plan for the establishment of a common security perimeter around Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and the eventual fusion of the 3 countries into a single one, the North American Union, with a common currency, the Amero. The Iraq Study Group, co-chaired by former Secretary of State James Baker and former Congressman Lee Hamilton, is created. Its purpose is to conduct a forward-looking, independent assessment of the current and prospective situation on the ground in Iraq. Other members of the Iraq Study Group include Lawrence Eagleburger, Vernon Jordan, Sandra O'Connor, William Perry, and Charles Robb. President Bush appoints Robert Gates to replace Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense. Lawrence Eagleburger replaces Robert Gates as co-chair of the Iraq Study Group. In a CFR-sponsored online debate, Michael Levy and Graham Allison discuss the possibility of detonation of a nuclear device in a major American city. Since the end of World War II, the number of Council on Foreign Relations members in key government positions has been growing continuously. In the last 50 years, all U.S. Secretaries of State and CIA directors have been CFR members. The number of senior members of the armed forces that have CFR membership is growing. The most important people in the mainstream press are CFR members. CFR-controlled philanthropic foundations like the Rockefeller, Ford, MacArthur, and Carnegie bankroll every anti-American group in this country and many abroad.
This historical forensic analysis can extend for dozens of pages, but just the ones I have shown prove beyond any reasonable doubt that what many people have suspected is true. A cabal of non-elected people is making the big decisions and controlling our destiny. Now, if all the persons mentioned above would have been Jews, everybody would be talking about the Jewish conspiracy. If all of them would have been Italians, we would be for sure dealing with an Italian conspiracy. If all of them would have been New York Yankees fans or taxi drivers, I would be the first to talk about the baseball fans or taxi drivers conspiracy. But there are several million Jews in America, and as many Italians and probably even more New York Yankees fans and taxi drivers. In contrast, for many years, the Council on Foreign Relations has had less than 1,000 members, and now with its largest membership of all times, has a little more than 4,000 members. One can claim that the facts I have mentioned above are not true or difficult to confirm, but even if only half of them were true, and all of them are in the public domain and easy to verify, this should be a motive of concern for the American people. Also, some may think that my conclusions are fallacious because this small group of people have joined the Council on Foreign Relations only because of their prominence and money, and that is precisely what has made this organization so powerful. But, as in the cases of Henry Kissinger, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Maurice Strong, many of them have reached prominence and fortune thanks to their membership in the Council on Foreign Relations and not the other way around. How can we explain, without resorting to conspiracy theories, the fact that this small group of people control to such extent the foreign policy of the United States and of most countries in this hemisphere? How can we explain, without resorting to conspiracy theories, the fact that being so important and powerful and having such a control over the American mainstream media, the Council on Foreign Relations is almost unknown to the majority of the people in the United States and Latin America? The Council claims that it has no affiliation with the US government. Then, how can we explain these facts?
Since the end of World War II, almost every Secretary of State, CIA Director, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, National Security Council member, Federal Reserve Bank director, is or has been a member of CFR. Also, several U.S. senators and Supreme Court justices are CFR members.
Actually, no other organization, not even any of the three branches of the United States government, has such control over this country. Therefore, yes, no doubt about it, there is an invisible government, a high cabal, a power elite, a secret team, a group of conspirators, infiltrators, usurpers, insiders, or whatever name you choose, who, using Fabian infiltration techniques, has penetrated the three branches of the United States government and now has almost total control over it. It also controls the mainstream media and public education. Unfortunately, this group is currently in the process of also taking control of the governments of most Latin American nations. And this group of conspirators reside at the Harold Pratt House in Manhattan, headquarters of the Council on Foreign Relations. Granted, the Council on Foreign Relations is not the only organization working hard for establishing a totalitarian dictatorship in America and the world. But if one follows the money flowing in large quantities from Council on Foreign Relations controlled non-profit organizations, it becomes evident that most of the lines point to Wall Street, banks, and oil transnational corporations. The Council on Foreign Relations is not a homogeneous group. It consists of a central nucleus and several concentric layers. The nucleus is formed by the Rockefellers and a select group of oil magnates and Wall Street bankers. They are the ones who actually control the organization and know its secret goals. I call these people the planners because they are the brains behind the organization.
The central nucleus is surrounded by a thin ring of select individuals who enjoy the total confidence of the planners. This group actively participates in the implementation of the plans emanating from the central nucleus. They are the implementers. Notable among the implementers are Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter, John McCloy, Robert McNamara, and Dean Rusk. The Dulles brothers, Colonel House, Sumner Welles, and Prescott Bush also belong to this group. Add to this circle Bush's father and son, as well as Bill and Hillary Clinton. This internal ring is surrounded by another ring, a little wider, formed by a large group of opportunistic and unscrupulous individuals who have managed to infiltrate and control both the Republican and the Democratic parties, as well as the executive branch of the United States government and most of the Congress, the judges, the mainstream media, the system of public education, the universities, and the armed forces of this country. These are the executors because their role is to execute the plans emanating from the central nucleus. Most of these people have gained their power and influence thanks to their membership in the council. Typical executors are Colin Powell and Madeleine Albright. The Council on Foreign Relations has infiltrated the United States government to the point that it currently is a branch of the CFR. In the past 40 years, most of American presidents, vice presidents, secretaries of state, CIA directors, Supreme Court judges, and high-ranking Pentagon officers belong to these groups of CFR implementers and executors. For many years, the Council was a relatively closed society with less than 1,000 members. About 30 years ago, they decided to widen the circle, attracting a large group of individuals from broader spectrums of the American society. These people have found in the council an easy way to polish their enlarged egos and advance their careers. Likely, most of them have no real idea of the council's secret goals, but are part of a symbiotic relationship. They act as a smokescreen to hide the true goals of the council, while because of the prestige of the institution, they benefit from the relationship. This large group constitutes the cover. The existence of this cover explains why a handful of honest but disinformed people are council members. They comprise part of the outer ring.
If what I have described before seems like a conspiracy, it is because it is a conspiracy. And I'm not talking about the imaginary vast right-wing conspiracy mentioned by Hillary Clinton, but of a real vast right left-wing conspiracy a growing number of Americans is becoming aware of. Nor I'm talking about a conspiracy theory, but of a proof criminal conspiracy, a legal term clearly defined in the laws of this country.
According to the United States Code, it makes a separate federal crime or offense for anyone to conspire or agree with someone else to do something which, if actually carried out, would amount to another federal crime or offense. So under this law, a conspiracy is an agreement or a kind of partnership in criminal purposes in which each member becomes the agent or partner of every other member.
Initially, not all American presidents were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. These were the cases of Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, and Reagan. But like cart horses wearing blinds, the Council on Foreign Relations has managed to surround the presidents with a large group of its secret agents, most of them grouped in the National Security Council. The National Security Council is a key element in understanding how the Council on Foreign Relations conspirators control the United States government. It was thanks to the efforts of Council on Foreign Relations secret agents infiltrated in the US government that President Truman approved the creation of the National Security Council in 1947. It was supposed to be a tool to manage the military, intelligence, and foreign policy areas of the US government. But soon after it was created, the CFR agents in the National Security Council changed it into a tool to control the information reaching the eyes and ears of the presidents, thus creating a smoke screen of disinformation around them. This guarantees that their policy decisions are the ones already made at the Harold Pratt House. This process is best described by Fletcher Prouty in his book, The Secret Team, which explains why the book was practically censored and it is almost impossible to find.
To make things easier, the CFR created the concept of President's Plausible Denial, a euphemism for President's ignorance. Soon after, they expanded the concept with the notion that what the President doesn't know can't hurt him politically. This meant that the CFR conspirators, through their agents infiltrated in the White House, gave themselves a free hand in planning and carrying out American foreign policy with as little consultation as possible with the incumbent president.
Since the Second World War, the Council on Foreign Relations conspirators have been treating American presidents like mushrooms, keeping them in the dark and feeding them manure. But probably the best example of an American president on blinds was John F. Kennedy.
This curtain of disinformation around the US presidents explains why even the few presidents who were not CFR agents have unknowingly advanced the goals of the CFR planners.
In the same fashion, dozens of books written by Council on Foreign Relations members have advanced the notion that it was President Kennedy who actually had the idea of changing the invasion point from Trinidad to the Bay of Pigs. Now we know for sure that Kennedy ordered the fateful change because Secretary of State Dean Rusk and presidential assistants McGeorge Bundy and James Schlesinger, all of them CFR members, persuaded him to do so.
Ronald Reagan, a true conservative who was not a CFR member, was an idealist and a true believer. He was convinced that his main role as American president was liberating the world from atheist communism, which he called the evil empire. Without waiting for the conspirators' approval, he began acting to destroy it. He was the target of an assassination attempt that almost cost him his life.
To avoid this type of surprises, after Reagan, not only have all American presidents been members of the Council on Foreign Relations, but also all the candidates running for both factions of the Republican Party. This was the case of Al Gore running against George W. Bush. In the 2004 presidential election, the travesty was even more shameless. Not only was Kerry part of the charade, but American voters were given the choice of electing either a Yale graduate, member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society and the CFR, who had cheated on his military records, or a Yale graduate, member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society and the CFR, who had cheated on his military records. If you are still not convinced that a group of conspirators is controlling the US government, I'll give you further proof directly from the insiders. 3 Council on Foreign Relations members who turned into whistleblowers: Rear Admiral Chester Ward, as Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, and former Assistant Secretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to Cuba, Spruill Brady.
At some time, Ward, Forrestal, and Braden realized that they had been recruited by the CFR under the false flag of that time, the fight against communism. But once they discovered the ruse, they did what they could to expose the true purposes of the Council. Admiral Chester Ward, a member of the CFR for over a decade, became one of its harshest critics, revealing its inner workings. In the 1975 book he co-authored with Phyllis Schlafly, Kissinger on the Couch, Ward stated, "The most powerful cliques in these elitist groups have one objective in common. They want to bring about the surrender of the sovereignty and national independence of the United States." Another whistleblower was James Forrestal, America's first Secretary of Defense. Forrestal was one of the earliest and strongest promoters of what was soon to be known as the Cold War. But he became very dismayed when he witnessed the deliberate refusal of the United States to win World War II, 2 full years before the hostilities ended. Forrestal saw how, as the result of a secret agreement between Roosevelt and Churchill, concocted by CFR conspirators, the U.S. rearmed Russia with Lend-Lease war materials, and then waited until Russia marched into Berlin and captured all of Eastern Europe. Forrestal was so upset with these events that he stated, "Consistency has never been a mark of stupidity. These men are not incompetent or stupid. If they were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor." Soon after, under suspicious circumstances, Forrestal allegedly committed suicide. The 3rd CFR whistleblower was Spruill Brady, former Assistant Secretary of State and ex-U.S. Ambassador to Cuba. On April 5, 1954, Renee Wormser, General Counsel for the U.S. House of Representatives, Special Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations, wrote to Spruill Brady concerning the Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford Foundations and the Rhodes Scholarship Trust. On April 10, 1954, Brady answered, "I have the very definite feeling that these various foundations you mention do exercise both overt and covert influences on our foreign relations. and that their influences are counter to the fundamental principles on which this nation was founded and have made it great. But undoubtedly, the most important CFR whistleblower of all times was Carroll Quigley, an obscure professor at Georgetown University. Not many Americans had heard about Quigley until President Clinton mentioned him in his speech. Carroll Quigley represents a key element in proving the existence of this conspiracy because he was an insider who enjoyed the confidence of the conspirators. And Quigley wrote about the conspiracy. But Quigley blew the whistle on the CFR conspirators not because he disagreed with their agenda. Contrary to Ward, Forrestal, and Braden, the naive professor believed that the conspirators' secret machinations only deserved praise and should be made known to the American public.
In his book, Tragedy and Hope, Quigley wrote about the existence of this conspiracy in very friendly and clear terms.
There does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communists act. In fact, this network has no aversion to cooperating with the Communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. The Council on Foreign Relations is the American branch of this network, and believes national boundaries should be obliterated and one world rule established.
An objection could be made that if this group of conspirators is so secret, how come they authorized Quigley to publish a book exposing its existence? Well, it seems that they didn't authorize it. Quigley, who had no objections to their secret machinations, took the liberty of publishing the book without their authorization. You already know his reason. He admired the conspirators so much that he believed their job should be known by the American people. Big mistake by the naive professor. Quigley's Tragedy and Hope was first published in 1966, but just a few weeks after the book appeared in the bookstores, the remaining unsold copies were withdrawn and the publisher refused to do a new printing because the negative had been destroyed by mistake. Since the publication of the book, Quigley's fortunes quickly turned sour. Perhaps a key to the source of his misfortunes is an article about Quigley published in the Washington Post in March 1975. The article was titled, "The Professor Who Knew Too Much." 2 years later, Professor Quigley passed away in obscurity. Some people speculate that he died under strange circumstances. Need more proof about the existence of this conspiracy? I have it for you. This is right from the horse's mouth. David Rockefeller himself. On page 405 of his memoirs, published in 2002, David says,
"For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounter with Castro to attack the Rockefeller family, for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it."
So, David Rockefeller himself, through his own words, confessed that the Rockefeller family wields an inordinate influence over American political and economic institutions. He has had a private encounter with Castro. The Rockefellers are part of a secret cabal against the best interests of the United States. They are internationalists. They conspire with others around the world to build a one world, also called the New World Order. He's guilty of this and proud of it. Of course, in his arrogance, David, like most tyrants and dictators, sees himself as a benevolent father figure, a sort of big brother working behind the scenes to make a better world for the rest of us. But this image, as I will show you in this documentary, is highly deceitful. Oh, and about the encounters with Fidel Castro, I will show you that there is more than meets the eye.
Like a malignant cancer, the Council has metastasized into a pervasive group of organizations, all of them created with the financial help of the Rockefellers and their Wall Street friends. Among the main ones are the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderberger Group, as well as the United Nations organizations and its dependent organizations like UNESCO, the World Churches Organization, the World Health Organization, and the rest of the communo-fascist organizations they have created over the years with the pretext of protecting the environment, free trade, and third world women's reproductive health, a euphemism for Malthusian eugenics. These people also control the main international financial organizations, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The ultimate goal of these organizations is the creation of a new world order, which is nothing but a communo-fascist totalitarian dictatorship under the control of the Wall Street bankers and the transnational corporations. Very similar to what Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini called the corporate state.
One may argue that one of the characteristics of fascism is its furious nationalism, while these people champion globalization. But in a time of transnational corporations, it makes sense that the new fascism they envision will be global. The recent midterm election proved to be a total disaster for the Republican Party. According to most political analysts, the election was actually a referendum on President George W. Bush. Contrary to the common wisdom that midterm elections are dominated by local politics, the main reason for this Republican defeat was Bush's performance on foreign policy, particularly in the war with Iraq and the fight against terrorism. Addressing a Montreal audience last October, Pulitzer-winning journalist Seymour Hersh got close to the source of the problem when he hinted.
The responsibility for the invasion of Iraq lies with 8 or 9 members of the administration who have a neo-conservative agenda and dictate the U.S.'s post-September 11th foreign policy. Hersh said, "How fragile is democracy in America if a president can come in with an agenda controlled by a few cultists?"
What the American people ignores, and Hersh failed to mention, is that most members of the neocon think tank dictating the Bush administration foreign policy. Paul Wolfowitz, Norman Podhoretz, Elliot Abrams, Richard Perley, Jean Kirkpatrick, Max Boot, Irving Kristol, Robert Kagan, and Peter Rodman, and their most prominent supporters inside the administration by President Dick Cheney, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and ex-Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, not to mention President George W. Bush himself, are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Contrary to what the disinformers and brainwashers want us to believe, Bush, like the presidents before him, has absolutely no control over any key foreign policy issue or any other issue, foreign or domestic for that matter. Vital things in this country are not decided by our presidents, but by Wall Street bankers and owners of oil transnationals at the secret meetings of the Council on Foreign Relations. A key to understanding where the true source of power resides in the US is the fact that the recognized architects of the US foreign policy are not American presidents, but a small group of men which became known as the Wise Men. They are Robert Lovett, John McCloy, Averell Harriman, Charles Bolin, George Kennan, and Dean Acheson. Except Lovett, all of them were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Lovett was not a CFR member, but like President George W. Bush and John Kerry, he was a member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society. Today, the CFR's control over the US government is even larger than at the time of the wise men.
The day after the 2004 elections, President George W. Bush announced that he has accepted the resignation of Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, CFR. Later, it was known that he had nominated ex-CIA Director Robert Gates, CFR, to substitute Rumsfeld. Just a few months before the election, at the urging of Congress, the United States Institute of Peace created a bipartisan Iraq study group. Co-chaired by former Secretary of State James Baker, CFR, and former Congressman Lee Hamilton, CFR. The purpose of the Iraq study group was to conduct a forward-looking, independent assessment of the current and prospective situation on the ground in Iraq. Other members of the Iraq study group include Lawrence Eagleburger, CFR, Vernon Jordan, CFR, Sandra O'Connor, CFR, William Perry, CFR, and Charles Robb, CFR.
But if the results of previous CFR control commissions serve as a guide, I suggest that you don't expect too much from this one.
On November 10, 2006, Eagleburger, CFR, replaced Gates, CFR, as a co-chair of the Iraq study group. Gates resigned in a conversation with Baker, explaining that he felt he could no longer serve on the Iraq study group after President George W. Bush announced his nomination as Secretary of Defense.
The CFR's game of musical chairs goes on and on.
The brainwashed American public went to the polls with the wrong belief that by bringing the Democratic faction of the Republican Party to power, things would change for the better. They were wrong. Once more, Americans have been shortchanged. After taking control of Congress, members of the Democratic faction of the Republican Party are talking about a new direction in American domestic and foreign policy. If there is any appreciable change, it will be a tactical one, just enough to make gullible Americans believe that there has been a true change. But the CFR's secret agents, infiltrated in both factions of the Republican Party, will guarantee that the overall strategic goal will continue being the same: destroying this country as we know it, and bringing about the communo-fascist tyranny of the New World Order.
You can bet that in the coming presidential election in 2008, the Republican candidate elected will be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And this president will appoint even more CFR members to key government positions than previous presidents. And no serious non-CFR control commissions to investigate the 9/11 events will be created. And the borders will remain open, and the process of changing the US into a third world country will continue uninterrupted. And things, as usual, will keep going from bad to worse. And the president American voters will elect in 2008 most likely will be the last president of the United States of America as a sovereign nation. Soon after, the United States of America will disappear as a sovereign country after fusing itself with Canada and Mexico into the new North American Union. If an unfriendly foreign power had carried out against the United States the actions carried out by the Wall Street bankers and oil magnates entrenched at the CFR, we might well have considered it an act of war. For almost a century, these people have been waging a quite non-declared war of attrition against the American people, and it seems that they are now ready for the final, decisive battle. Unfortunately, as the recent midterm elections shows, the American people have reacted against the puppets, leaving the puppet masters untouched. If some of you think that this vision of history is too conspiratorial, I would say that conspiring is precisely what intelligence and espionage organizations do, including the Council on Foreign Relations. Their main job consists of lying, disinforming, obfuscating, spying, and conspiring to carry out their secret plans. This is Truth Lies, and I am Servando Gonzalez.